Texture is a great tool we use in design to give a project a certain mood or feeling. It really relates to a tactile experience that we have, and it can either be done physically or virtually. Texture gives a design piece a look or feel, or a surface. Think about the different textures that we encounter every day. There are probably textures around you right now in the place that you're watching this video. Here's some simple textures that you might be able to relate to. The left is a crocheted blanket. We know that that's going to feel really soft, and it's going to have that texture as those pieces of fabric loop around each other. We have wood grain, and this is a piece where you can tell that the wood grain is really deep and it's something that you could feel. Or a brick wall on the far right. We know that touching that it would feel rough, that we'd feel the grooves of the grout between the individual bricks. So all of these are going to give a different feeling, which can be really useful in your design work to help create a mood or a feeling through your piece. Texture is the surface character of a physical material or the illusion of a physical material. Texture is defined as the surface characteristics of a material that can be experienced through the sense of touch or the illusion of touch. This is really related to tactile experiences we have. Like we've talked about, sometimes you will use physical textures, things that we actually can touch in your work, but sometimes we reference those textures, and because they're familiar or things that we understand as we look at them, we have an idea of how they might feel if we were actually able to touch them. Here's a good example of a piece that uses both kinds of texture. These are promotional materials for a cotton company done by Viscom Workshop in Beijing, China. And on the left, we have the cover of this little promotional booklet. And it's done on this cardstock. It's kind of a cardboard-like material. And we can tell by looking at that we know it's going to feel smooth. But it might have a little bit of a roughness to it because it's an uncoated piece of paper and it's going to have that natural feeling like cardboard. But then if you look in the cover, there's actually all of these holes that are cut out. They're perforations. And we know that if we ran our fingers over them, we would feel all of those holes and our fingers might push slightly through to the piece of paper behind it. So that's going to have another tactile experience for us. But then on the right, we have another physical texture, more perforation where that CD is coming out of that pocket. But then on the back of that booklet in black and white, we have a close-up photo of cotton. It's actually cotton growing on the plant. And we can tell by looking at it that it's fluffy, it's soft, it looks like a cloud. And so by using this close-up image of cotton, it's helping us see that texture and helping us understand how it might feel. Now touching this, it obviously wouldn't feel like cotton, but because we're simulating that texture and creating a virtual version of it, we have an idea of what that would feel like even if we can't actually touch what's in that photograph. Texture can help you create a particular mood for your layout. Texture can also be used in your layout to add dimension and richness. Here's an example of a website that uses texture. This is a website for Third by Kenjiro. It was designed by Monpro, which is a studio out of Japan, and also has offices in New York City and London. But you can see this use of this texture throughout this entire site. We sort of have this like pencil shading or some kind of smudging that's going on. We have that in that red-orange color in the upper left behind the logo and kind of scattered throughout the web page. We also have some sort of a paper wrinkled texture that's behind everything. That's creating a lot of depth and interest on this website. If that was all flat in one color, you wouldn't have that illusion of depth. And also we have this line that's kind of following the cursor. What's interesting about that is it's done as like a pencil line. So all of these little touches are adding warmth to this site. They're making it feel like it's a little bit more handmade. And it's really vital. The texture is really telling a story here and helping make this website have a unique look and feel. Here's another example of texture. Here's texture that we could actually touch. This is a letterpress piece by Rise and Shine Letterpress out of Louisiana. And here we actually have a deboss. So what's happening here is there's a plate that is pushed into this paper and compressed it in certain areas where these lines are. And it's actually creating an indentation. So if you ran your hand across this piece, you would feel the indentations in the paper. So this is something that we physically could touch. There's also some foil stamping going on in certain areas, but this is another example of using texture in our work. It's creating a really interesting tactile experience for the user. There are two types of textures. The first, physical texture, can be felt. For example, think about the different pieces of paper you have handled and often something you have taken for granted. It's just there, but paper can be an important textural element in your physical work. But texture can come in other ways too. And physical textures are any time that we're playing with materials and using different kinds of paper or wood or plastics to make something have a certain mood or feeling that you can touch. So similar to the example we looked at earlier, here's another letterpress example. This is from Studio on Fire. They're a letterpress studio out of St. Paul, Minnesota. But here we have all the different kinds of letterpress work that they can do, all kinds of different specialty printing. So letterpress, foil stamping, engraving, embossing, etc., etc. And you can see down second from the bottom, we have a deboss, which is what we were looking at earlier. That's where that paper is actually pressed and there's an indentation. But then right above it is an emboss, which is the opposite. That's where the paper actually raises up. So letterpress being a physical style of printing, there's a lot of ability for us to make a lot of different tactile experiences for the viewer or the user of whatever the product that's created. So this is a great example of all different kinds of textural effects that can be done through letterpress printing. Here's another one. This is by Device. They're a studio out of North Carolina, and this is the Renolda shopping bag. So this is a shopping district, and they created a bag. But here you can see a couple things. We have, again, some kind of letterpress style printing. So we have foil being used on the bottom of this bag. But if you look closely, you can also tell that this paper has a certain feel. Sometimes we call that a tooth. The tooth is that rough kind of texture component to the paper. And this actually has some kind of natural element, some kind of textural component that's making the paper have a certain feel. If you touch that, you know that it would not be smooth. So these are other examples of physical textures that we use in design work. A great example of one that's coming from the use of a specific material, here a certain kind of paper. Here's another physical example. This is the Brass Onion. It's a restaurant, and it was designed by Carpenter Collective. They're out of Kansas City, Missouri. But here you can see the use of wood this time. So this menu is actually on kind of a wood board, and that wood would have a certain feeling to it. You can tell that it's more smooth wood. You can still see the grain, but the grain here really isn't exaggerated. You can tell that it's maybe been sanded to make it a little smoother. But then on the back of the menu on the left, you have something interesting. There's actually a laser engraving that's happened of this logo. So you can see that part of the wood's been taken away to create that image of the Brass Onion logo. And you can tell that the wood grain where that burning has happened is actually a little bit more exaggerated. It looks a little bit more rough. And then also there's a textural feeling of touching that because there's a difference in depth between the main back part of the menu and then where that part of the wood has been burned away. So this is another example of using a physical material to create texture. Great example. There's also some engraving happening on the front of the menu at the top. There's also some interesting paper that's being used here. But these are the use of different materials that are creating a really interesting tactile experience and a great use of texture. Here's another one. This is an olive oil packaging by Pacifica. They're a studio out of Portugal. Here's another example of tooth on paper. If you look closely at this paper, you can tell it has kind of a natural tooth to it. You can see these little lines running through it, and you can tell that if you touch this, it wouldn't be completely smooth. Similar to the shopping bag example that we looked at. But there's all kinds of other materials being used here. There's the cork on the top of the bottle. That's an interesting use of a material that has a strong texture. There's this cord that's being used to actually seal the bottle, which we can see and kind of tell that it has an interesting texture. And then again, we have some debossing. If you look at the bottom of this label, you'll notice that there's some words that are debossed into this label, which again also would have an interesting textural component. And the last one is the handwriting. Up at the top, you see bottle, batch, and harvest date, and there's some handwriting there. And that also has a little bit of a textural component. You can tell that that's not printed. You can tell that that was done with a ballpoint pen and written by hand. There's an imperfection to it that makes it really interesting. And there's also a textural component to that as well. So this is a piece that's using a lot of different textures to create a really interesting experience. We also talked specifically about papers quite a bit. We talked about how all of them have a different feel. If you grab paper around you or any paper that you might have and you touch them, you'll notice that they all feel a little bit different. We talked about this in some of the examples that I showed so far, but if you touch a newspaper or a magazine or paper from a printer, you'll notice that they all have a little bit of a different feel. Here's an example of some paper samples. These are books that are available to designers that you can use when you work with a printer that help you pick out the paper that you might use. And here's a wide example. Some of these have special finishes. Some of these have different kinds of textures that are built into the paper. So that's really obvious. But even the ones that don't have that, you can tell that they might feel a little bit different. Some of them might be more smooth. Some of them might be more rough. Some of them are slightly patterned. Some of them might feel a little bit fuzzy. Some of them might feel more slick. And so paper is a really great way to add texture to your piece. If you're ever working on something with printing and you're using paper, it's an important decision to make, because papers are going to give a different feeling and a different mood that you want to leverage to support your design work. So those are physical textures. The second are virtual textures or simulated textures. These are used to create the illusion of a texture in your design. These sometimes reference physical textures and simulate their appearance, but sometimes not. So this is something where you aren't actually physically using wood, but you might show wood in an image that will make someone think of wood. So again, they're simulated or they're virtual. Also, blocks of type have a texture depending on the density of black. So when you use type, type also has what we might call a texture, or sometimes we call it a color. So depending how bold the type is, how tightly it's set, it might feel like it has a denser texture than if you actually set it in a lighter font and maybe spaced it out more, it would have a little bit of a lighter texture. So that's sometimes another way that we use the word texture when referring to typography. So here's a logo. This is a logo for the fish market. This was done by Kelly Stromsky. She's out of Massachusetts and runs a studio called Favor the Brave. But you can see that there's kind of a degradation happening inside the type for fish. There's some sort of areas that have purposefully been worn away, which gives this a little bit more of a rough, industrial kind of feeling. It makes it feel like it's older. So this is an example where texture is being used inside of typography to give it a certain mood. Now again, this isn't a physical texture, this isn't something you could touch. It's being simulated through the computer to give you a certain feeling, to give you visual cues that help you know what kind of mood the designer is trying to build. Here's a cool example on the web. This is John Way. It's a studio website of his graphic design work. And so you can see examples of his work, but you can also tell that there's kind of a grain texture being run over this entire website, which creates a really interesting mood. It's got this very moody, kind of dark, interesting vibe to it. Maybe you could argue that it makes it a little bit hard to see the work, but it definitely creates a lot of style really quickly. So it's an interesting use of texture on the web. Texture on the web is really important because the web typically can feel like a very kind of sterile place. And by adding texture, you create a lot of interest and can create a lot of warmth. I think this is a good example of using texture on a website. Here's a great example of text creating texture. So this is a book about the Chinese artist Stanley Wang. And you can tell that the entire cover of the book, every single side of it, including the pages side, has printing on it. And the printing is in different languages, but it's also in different typefaces. Some are bold, some are light, some are large, some are small. And through those different typeface choices and type decisions, they're actually creating a lot of texture. This overall cover has this very textural component to it that's really being created by contrasting different kinds of typefaces and type settings. So it's a really interesting use of type being used as texture. Also quite a beautiful piece. Here's some tea packaging. An interesting one because we have actually a physical texture on the front. On the far right, you can see that they've selected a paper that has a little bit of a wood grain to it. Or maybe it's brush strokes, but I'm pretty sure it's wood grain. Now that might have been something that they created custom for this project, or it could be a stock paper that they found and are using. But then you'll notice behind it, there's also a simulated or a virtual texture, kind of running over that back portion in the copper or some kind of a metallic ink is the impression of a wood grain. It's actually continuing the wood grain that we see on the front on that brown piece of paper that is a physical texture, but that texture is being extended virtually through the metallic printing. That's not something you can touch, but it's really referencing that wood grain that's on that front piece and kind of continuing it and creating a virtual texture that's supporting the physical texture. Here's a really interesting one. This is a portfolio website by Bryant Smith. He's a designer in Chicago. What's fun about this one is there's sort of this hand-done thing happening here. All of these things are done by hand. It almost doesn't even look like they were actually drawn with a pen or a pencil. It looks like they were drawn on an iPad or some kind of a digital tablet-like device. But it creates a certain wacky mood that really helps you know maybe what this designer is all about. So here there's an emphasis of hand-done elements that are being done in a digital way that creates a really strong texture and a strong virtual texture. Here's a piece by Studio MLPS. They're out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and this is a maple syrup brand called Crown. This is an interesting one. If you look on the far right, there's their logo, that crown. But if you look inside of it, there's an illustration of wood grain. That same wood grain actually appears in the background on the middle shirt. But another example of a virtual texture or a simulated texture. So here we have an illustration of wood grain. It doesn't feel like wood grain, but because it's drawn to reference it and we know what that looks like, it creates a certain mood, right? It gives it a naturalistic feeling. It makes us think that this must come from the forest, right? Because maple syrup comes from trees. So there's a strong relationship between this virtual texture and the brand itself and the values of what they stand for. Invented textures are mostly virtual textures purely made up by the creator. It doesn't look like a real texture. So this isn't where we're referencing wood grain or brickwork or things like that. It's where we sort of invent a texture that's made by that creator. So here's some fun ones. These are physical textures. Here on the left, we have this fabric. It has all these dots that are sort of debossed into the fabric, the white, and you're sort of seeing something coming through. It could be some kind of a metallic indentation, or it could be a fabric that's behind it that's being exposed. But we can tell that there's depth here, and there's some kind of a tactile texture that we could touch. Great example of an invented physical texture. On the right, we have a wall covering. This is really interesting. It's a tile-like product where there's sort of these chiseled organic shapes that are being chiseled out of that physical material, and then it's being placed on a wall. This is, again, another example of an invented physical texture. You can tell that there's grooves in that material that you could touch, but it's not something that comes from nature. It's something that was purely created and invented. Here's some wallpaper patterns. These are good examples of invented textures. These are just things that people invented. Wallpaper and wrapping paper are great examples of places that you often see invented textures. These aren't physical, these are simulated. So these are flat pieces if you touch them, but they're creating some depth with the density of the line work that they are creating. But they're also just creating a lot of interest through these invented textures and patterns that are being used in these wallpapers. And that gets us to a pattern. A pattern is a type of visual texture. When an image or a line of type is repeated many times, the patterns of lights and darks add dimension to a surface. Wrapping paper is a good example of pattern. Patterns can make excellent backgrounds and borders in your layouts. So patterns are when there's an object or a series of objects that repeat, and good patterns can repeat indefinitely. That's why wallpaper or wrapping paper are good examples, because they're things that we usually are familiar with. And you know that when you buy a roll of wrapping paper, you only really get to see a very small portion of it. But even through seeing that small portion, you know what that entire roll is going to look like, because that pattern repeats and continues in the same way as the small portion that you see. So here's some examples of wrapping paper. Some simple patterns, some more complicated ones, but a great example of pattern, which is a type of texture. Here's a fun piece that uses pattern. This is by Anne Walsh, a studio in New York City, and this is Zuba. They're an Egyptian street food company that is in New York City, and you can see this use of all of these patterns on the side of this building with this green, blue, black, white palette. Really fun work. I'm assuming most of these patterns are cultural and represent Egypt in some way, but it's a really fun way to activate the side of this building and make it really interesting and engaging in a place that maybe we want to go in and try. Patterns can be very simple or they can be complex, but again, they're about repetition. They're about some kind of a repeating element that can go on forever to create a pattern that could cover a small area or a really large area. So here's an example of a very simple pattern on the left, a very simple geometric pattern, as opposed to the more complex, more illustrated pattern on the right. And neither one is right or wrong. It just depends on what you want to use and what kind of mood you want to create in your piece. But sometimes when you're covering a larger area, it can be better to use a more complex pattern. It might be more interesting, as opposed to using simpler patterns in smaller areas. Texture and color are the most direct route to the emotions of your audience. These really help people understand the mood. Color and texture are really powerful tools that we often use to help people understand what we're trying to communicate and support the messages that we're trying to create. Photographs of texture can be useful to include in your design work. Utilizing blending modes in Illustrator or by creating bitmap TIFF files, you are able to create textures from images that can be used in vector work. This is actually one of the projects that you're going to work on for this section. So here you're seeing that process. On the left is this very interesting rock wall where we have cracks and grooves and a lot of texture in that rock. And on the right, this has gone through a process in Photoshop to create a file that can be used where we can leverage that texture and include it in our design work in a really interesting way. There's actually a book by von Glitschka called Crumble, Crackle, Burn. And this is an example from the book. It actually is a book that comes with a CD where you can download all of these textures and use them in your work. And on the left, you have a very simple red and white vector line work of this illustration. It feels really flat, but it's still really interesting because it's a relatively complex illustration. But you can see on the right, when we add texture to it, it just creates a lot of mood. It creates a lot of depth and interest to this piece. So it's a great example of how texture can sometimes really bring something to life. Here's some work from Sophia Yeshi. She's an illustrator and designer in Brooklyn, and you can see the use of texture here. There's sort of an airbrushing, a kind of dotted texture that's being used on this woman's suit. It's being used a little bit on her cheeks. There's even a texture in the green shapes behind. Again, it brings something to life, it adds depth, it creates a lot of interest for the viewer, And texture is something you'll see really often in illustration work. On the right, there's a lot of texture being used as well, some halftone patterns. Halftone patterns are dots that sort of group in a little bit of a grid and then sometimes taper off and get smaller. But you can see that behind this woman in the window. You can also see it being used in the background, which is creating a little bit of depth. It's even helping create a little bit of the shadow that's in this illustration. So let's look at some ways that you can use texture in your work, because again, it's a really powerful way to communicate emotion, and it can be done in a lot of different ways. One way is through images. Using an image that has a visual texture that relates to your concept can be a really great way to make that emotional connection that you want. So here's a flooring company. This is by Stitch Design Company from Charleston. And here we have Old Savannah Flooring Company. And not only is there a texture in their actual logo, that tree at the top has a really beautiful wood grain inside of it, but then on top of it, they layered this on this really interesting wooden planked floor that has a ton of texture. It immediately helps you see the kinds of wood floors that they create. It helps you understand what they're selling and what they're all about. Here's another interesting one. This is for Jazak Natural Water, and this is their website landing page. And they've actually used all of these trees that are sort of simulated to create the outline of the bottle for the packaging. What's really great is through that bottle, we see this really beautiful waterfall or river that's coming down into this really idyllic, clear pond. So immediately there's emotional connection to how natural this water is, right? They're trying to project that it comes from this beautiful source in nature and that it's the cleanest water you can imagine and that you're going to enjoy drinking and it's going to be absolutely delicious. So another example where they're using photographs to create an emotional connection for you to understand this brand of water. Here's one last one. This is the packaging for Mighty Leaf. They're a tea company. This was done by Pearl Fisher. They're an agency out of New York City. And you can see that on the front of each of these packages, they've taken the M from Mighty Leaf and they've actually used the T to create that M. So they're creating an instant connection that this is tea. It's also a little bit of an identifier. The tea that's being used is actually the tea that's in the package, so it kind of helps you differentiate between these different kinds of tea as you're shopping for them on the shelf. But again, a fun way of using photographs of texture to really enhance the connection of the product and create a mood for the user or the purchaser who might purchase this tea. Again, paper stocks can be really useful. They'll really enhance a piece's mood or personality, and they can create contrast or interest for the user as well. Here's an example of paper textures being used on the web. This is the paper portfolio by Nicola Miranda out of Amsterdam. You can tell that there's this newsprint-like texture being used in the background of this entire website, which is really interesting. It creates a lot of warmth. It really, again, enhances that mood and helps you understand this newspaper-like inspiration. You also notice that there's a portion where there's a loading effect that comes up, where there's actually a ripped paper edge. It happens right about here. And then it happens again, but that ripped paper edge, again, is an interesting use of a texture that's helping that transition animation happen and is really reinforcing this idea that this is a newspaper-driven portfolio. Here's one that uses all different kinds of paper. So this is actually a paper sample for a company called Acumen Paper. This was done by Studio WMW in Hong Kong, but they're using all different kinds of papers. So first of all, you can see on the upper left, there's a paper that has a little bit of a wood grain pattern in it, as opposed to the box lid on the right, which has kind of more of a smooth appearance. There's the use of metallic ink, so foil stamping, which creates a different texture. You know that that sheen is going to feel a little bit more smooth and a little bit more slick. And then there's even a piece of vellum, this piece in the bottom left that says Inspire Create. It's a translucent piece of material that we call vellum, and that's going to feel a little bit different too. So here there's a lot of playing with different paper stocks, and that makes sense, right? Because this is a paper sample and the goal of this piece is to really show off what paper can do. But it's a great example of uses of different kinds of paper to create a really strong connection to the materials themselves, because those are actually what's being sold in this case. Here's another simulated one. Some of you may have seen these ads. They're for Sherwin-Williams. It's the Color Chips campaign. It was developed by McKinney. They're a US advertising agency. But it's actually these scenes where they create objects, animals, environments completely out of those color chips that you might get when you're picking out paint at a hardware store or at a Sherwin-Williams store. So it's really neat how they're referencing that. You can see the use of all these color chips to make these flamingos. So it's again a use of a virtual texture that's really creating a nice connection and a conceptual play to the materials themselves. Again, patterns are really useful. That's another thing that you can use. You can build a pattern that can be applied to create interest or create a certain mood for your piece. This is a fun one. This is by Anonymous. They're a studio out of Thailand and Singapore. And this is for a design film festival that happens every year in Singapore. And this particular year was themed around the Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama. If you know her work, she really deals a lot with the idea of infinity, and one of the ways that she expresses that is through polka dots. So it's interesting how they're using her polka dots. They're using them in red on this white paper, but then there's also cutouts. So there's actually cutouts being done in here that kind of simulate that pattern as well and creates a physical component to that pattern, right? That's something that you could touch and feel. And that goes in conjunction with the pattern itself of the red dots that are printed on this piece. Here's some other examples of patterns. These sometimes can be done to hint at a certain cultural concept, a little bit like the Zuba example that we showed, where those patterns are on the side of the building and referencing Egyptian culture. Here's some other ones that are interesting. The left is Tinku Patterns, which is a piece that was done by Vanessa Zuniga Tinzare, and she's a designer out of Ecuador, and this was a piece that she did in collaboration with a type foundry called Sutipos. They're out of Latin America, and it's a font in a way, but it's a font that makes all these different patterns. And these patterns come from research that she did in a cultural anthropology museum in Ecuador. And so it's really interesting use of patterns. They're really bold, really engaging. They're done in a really great color palette as well. On the right is a piece by Sadie Redwing. She is a Native American designer in the United States, and it's a college pride, native pride piece. So she's actually using cultural motifs and patterns that reference native patterns from the United States, done in a really appropriate way, especially considering that she's Native American and she's drawing from her own culture to support something that's about native pride. Another way we sometimes use texture is to make something feel handmade or worn. It can be a really useful way to make something have more of a worn or an aged look, and we saw this earlier in that fish logo. But let's look at some other examples of ways that we can do that. Here's one on the web. This is a piece for the 96 Elephants. It's a mobile website that's about supporting elephants. It's a nonprofit. It was done by Viget. It's an agency out of Falls Church, Virginia. But you can see that there's a lot of texture going on here. If you look on the left, there's the sign the petition. Behind that button is sort of a gritty, worn texture. There's even kind of a leather pattern happening at the very top behind the 96 Elephants header. There's texture in all of the typography. We even have texture on the far right as we look at that close-up of that elephant. You can see the kind of wrinkles and indentations in the skin of that animal. So a really interesting way that they're using texture here to kind of evoke a certain mood. It's creating a sense of urgency. It's creating a sense of importance to this gritty subject matter and how we really need to support saving elephants. Here's one in illustration. This is from Mike McQuaid. He's an illustrator out of Richmond, Virginia. And this is a piece he did for New York Times Magazine about Roger Stone. And you can see just this use of this really worn, gritty texture. They're being woven throughout all of the pieces. It almost looks like this has been photocopied multiple times over and over that gives it that kind of gritty quality. There's also some brush strokes that are being used and run through different parts of the illustration, like the hand on the left-hand side. And this is a way that we can use texture in our work. This is one of the things we're going to explore. Although we won't be creating full illustrations like this, this uses a lot of the processes that will be in the first part of the project that you'll work on. And then one last one. This is from Invisible Creature. They're a studio out of Seattle, Washington, and this is the Young the Giant album art. But you can see this use of all kinds of texture on the cover of this record. So we have a texture in the background. There's some kind of a worn, aged texture that's being used to create that sky. And then all of the triangular shapes have different textures in them. Some of them are patterns, like wallpaper patterns, or some of them are stamps or handwriting. Some of them are just obscure textures that feel like cracked sidewalk or walls. There's even that little kind of yellowish moon shape, circular shape that's on the right side that has type in it. So they're kind of using lots of textures and they're isolating in different shapes and layering them together to create this really interesting illustration. So another good example of a mixing of textures and particularly of patterns and textures at the same time. So let's look at the assignments that you're going to be working on for the texture section of this course. The first one is to find or create images of textures that can be manipulated and used in your design work. These can be anything from wood grain to a cracked sidewalk. They can be photographs taken by you, or you can find them on the internet. So you're going to be looking for 3 of them, and you do not have to actually photograph these yourself, although you're welcome to. One of them, though, does need to be created by you using a pencil or a pen or a brush or any kind of tool that you have. So one of the 3 textures needs to be hand done. It needs to be created by you. The other 2 can be photographs that you take or you find on the internet. You're going to crop these images and then manipulate them to be usable in Illustrator. So here's a little bit of what this will look like. This is one, you will do this 3 times. On the far left, I have a photograph I found of wood grain. And then in the middle, I have the bitmap TIFF process. So I've processed that texture to make it black and white and to make it usable in Adobe Illustrator. And on the far right, I have it utilized. So I'm playing with color here. There's a background color being introduced, and then a change to the color of the texture to this sort of beigeish gold color that's really helping it stand out and be in strong contrast to the background. So this is what you'll be doing on this one. You'll be doing it 3 times. And again, one of the textures does need to be created by hand and then photographed by you or scanned into the computer and then processed to be used. So you'll do this 3 times. It's a really fun way. A lot of the examples we showed in this lecture are created this way, and it's a great connection between textures in the environment that you photograph or things that you make by hand and how you can incorporate them into your design work. The second part will use typography. You'll use the text document in the learning module to create 5 justified planes of text, each with its own visual texture. You're going to produce variations of value, density, and transparency by using different type styles. So you can use serifs, sans serifs, slab serifs, all caps, lowercase, anything you like. You're going to adjust the light to dark value or the typographic color or texture of each square by changing the tracking, leading, and other attributes. So this is similar to what we talked about in the lecture, where you're going to actually create texture out of type. So you must use the provided text document. There's text that you need to use for this that will give you certain words. But you can play with all of the different type settings, including typeface, leading, tracking, all kinds of things to create different densities in the text that will create a visual texture out of typography. So there's a little bit of what that might look like. On the far left, they've taken the text and they've actually tracked it very tightly, used tight leading and a bold typeface to create almost like a black background that all the white text comes on top of. But then you can see in other areas on the right, they're creating portions that are more dense and less dense. So this is about exploring the way that you can manipulate typography to create texture. There are assignment sheets for both of these that you should read and understand in greater detail. There's also software tutorials that'll help you execute these projects as well. And don't forget, your instructors are always there to help you with any questions you might have. Please get in touch with them if you do have any. And I hope you enjoy working on texture and learning a little bit more about how you can use it in your design work.